on? Okay. First of all, thanks very much for being here and for being a part of what has really been a critically important citizen movement. And it's included people from everywhere in Connecticut. It's included many gun owners, as well as those who are very concerned about the issue, as all Americans are, of gun safety, of gun violence prevention. I've been asked to speak a little bit about what happened in the legislature in 2013 in the wake of the tragedy at Sandy Hook. And I want to begin by asking us to pause and reflect on the children, the teachers, and the administrators who lost their lives on that day. But I also want us to think about all of the other men, women, and children across America who before and since that time have lost their lives due to gun violence, and including and especially in the cities and the poor neighborhoods that don't as often get the kind of press coverage and attention that crimes elsewhere receive. So we can just pause for a second and reflect upon those tragic losses of life. Thank you. You know, there has been a lot of distortion about gun violence prevention, and it's intentional, because when gun owners know the truth about the laws that have been passed in this country, like the Brady Bill, or the legislation that was passed in 2013 in Connecticut, we get a very open response. 92% of the people in America want universal background checks. That includes the vast majority of gun owners in America who are concerned about gun violence. But what do they hear from certain gun organizations and corporations who want to sell for profit increasingly lethal military-style weaponry? They hear distortion. They don't get the facts. They're told that somehow the Constitution is being trampled upon, that they won't be able to do what they want to do as sportsmen or to protect their home. You know, I recently heard President Clinton speak in New Haven, and he talked about Connecticut's gun law and praised the concern that the people of Connecticut have for gun safety and keeping guns out of the hands of criminals. And he talked about the passage of the Brady Bill when he was president, and how shortly after that he had gone to New Hampshire and talked to a group of deer hunters. And his staff thought that he had lost his mind, but he went in front of that group and said, you know, you might not be happy with me about the passage of the Brady Bill, but let's understand what the facts are. And we have to ask ourselves and yourselves, can you still hunt? Can you still target shoot? Can you still protect your family and firearms? The answer is yes. What is the problem? We are talking about keeping guns out of the hands of criminals. When Americans know the facts, and when gun owners know the facts, they support smart gun safety and gun violence prevention legislation. There are some who say, and you've heard them on radio talk shows and elsewhere, that gun legislation that the state of Connecticut passed would not have done a single thing to have prevented the tragedy at Sandy Hook. Has everybody heard that?
Yeah.
Everyone heard that said by folks? They don't know what they're talking about. I worked with Democrats and Republicans, leaders in both parties, to craft that legislation. I know what's in that bill. I know that they have not read it. If that legislation had been in effect when the perpetrator of that terrible crime in Sandy Hook was a younger man, because he was a young man when that happened, but when he was a younger man in elementary school. The mental health provisions in that bill that require greater stringency in our schools, in looking at the mental health of our young children, that require our pediatricians to identify issues sooner and work with schools, to look at our standards for special education, where problems that exist but do not interfere with academic performance are deemed problems not addressing or not worth addressing. If this legislation had been in effect, there is a chance, not a guarantee, there's a chance that there would have been a deeper understanding of this young man's issues and intervention at that time, and a possible different path and a connection to adults and caretakers who might have made a difference. That's in the legislation. If the legislation had been in effect, there would have been greater resources for school security. And I know about that because I sponsored legislation after the massacre at Virginia Tech to provide millions of dollars for our schools to harden their security, provide buzzer systems, keep the doors locked. The school at Sandy Hook had availed themselves of certain security procedures, such as the locked doors and the buzzer systems. But they did not have what this legislation includes, which is additional resources to harden the entryways in terms of bulletproof glass and other security measures. Those familiar with the tragic details of that day at Sandy Hook know that the door was locked. No one buzzed this young man through. He used an AR-15 assault rifle to blast through glass that was not hardened next to the door to enter the school. If that legislation had been in effect, and our schools had the opportunity, as they have now, to harden the security, then perhaps, no guarantee, perhaps the outcome could have been different on that day. As to the gun safety legislation, the mother of this young man bought all of the weapons in the high-capacity magazines legally. The vast majority of the crimes in America are committed with firearms that were either directly or indirectly purchased legally. Had this legislation been in effect, the AR-15 military-style assault rifle could not have been purchased. The high-capacity 30-round magazines could not have been purchased. Does that mean that it would have completely averted tragedy on that day? Not necessarily. But we know that children escaped when the magazines were changed out, swapped out. We know that there would have been more time for either children to have fled in, to have been saved, or for someone to have intervened. So the truth of the matter is, virtually everything in that bill could have changed the outcome that tragic day. So when you hear someone say there was nothing there that makes a difference, they haven't read the bill. They don't know what they're talking about. They've listened to the distortions and the falsehoods put forth by corporations that profit from the sale of lethal military hardware that is not used by hunters. It's not used by those in target practice, in target shooting competition. And it's certainly not necessary for the protection of your home or your family. this legislation came about because we did something different in Connecticut than has ever occurred in America. We took one of the most divisive issues, for all the reasons I have just discussed, and all the distortions that we hear from the other side, when folks intentionally withhold the facts from the people and from gun owners. It's one of the most divisive issues in America. And yet, we had Democrats and Republicans working together, forging not just a meaningful package of legislation that went part of the way, but, as has been said, the most comprehensive gun violence prevention, mental health and school security legislation in America. Nowhere else has that happened. You have to almost go back to the national level in a different time and place in 1968, where there was meaningful gun violence prevention legislation passed at the federal level, Democrats and Republicans working together, when the NRA was a group representing hunters, and when they too spoke up in favor of gun safety, gun violence prevention, and keeping firearms out of the hands of criminals. There were many times when the outcome was uncertain. There were many different issues that needed to be worked out by both sides. At the time, there were those who came to me and others who said, "Why are you working with the Republicans? Why don't you throw them out of the room?" But I have to say that the folks who negotiated this bill, who had sat through 5 public hearings, including a public hearing in Newtown, who listened to hundreds and hundreds of individuals on all sides of this issue provide their input, who look at the recommendations that were made by bipartisan task forces, Democrats and Republicans rolling up their sleeves and working together. What I found was leadership at the Capitol that rose to the occasion. Men and women who did what the people wanted. The people wanted gun safety. Again, 92% of the population of America wants us to keep the guns out of the hands of criminals or those who are so troubled that they might commit an act, such as in Sandy Hook. So the outcome at the end of the day was something extraordinary. Legislators of both parties coming together to pass legislation, the most comprehensive in the nation, in a way that has never been done in America. But I have to say this: that would not have happened without your participation. Previously, the year before, there had been a bill to ban the sale of high-capacity magazines. It had a public hearing. I think 2 or 3 people came to testify in favor of it, and everyone else testified against it. Folks had been mobilized to come up. What happened in 2013 was that we finally heard from the great silent majority of people in this state and in this country who care about ending gun violence in America. And it is a great majority. We know that. And that majority includes you, it includes your friends, it includes folks who network on social media, it includes the 5,000 people who came to rally at the Capitol. We had never seen that before in Connecticut, probably not in many other parts of America. But something changed. The folks with busy lives, who stay at home and find it hard once they get home because they've been so busy at work, taking kids to soccer practice, and dealing with a million other things in terms of the complexities of life. You all got at it, and and change the dynamic. That's why we had the ability to see legislators of both parties stand up and do the right thing, because they understood that the people of Connecticut wanted meaningful change. So going forward, we have to continue to reach out. This isn't an us versus them. This is not a small advocacy group against a small, extreme gun corporation group. This is the majority of America. The folks who, when they understand and get the facts, overwhelmingly support the reasonable gun safety and gun violence prevention legislation that we passed in Connecticut and that we wait for in Washington, D.C. So, let me just end by thanking you. You know, this is my last term. I've been in the Senate for 22 years. I've been Senate President for 10 and a half years. I've had the great honor and privilege of serving not only my constituents, but working on behalf of the people of the state of Connecticut. It is a great honor. We have this wonderful experiment of representative democracy in our country and in this state. And it will survive and flourish only so long as people come forward to fight for what's right and to speak the truth. Not to become discouraged by the distortions, but to speak the truth and connect with their fellow man and woman. So thank you very much for your help and support, and thank you so much for being active.